Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Maintaining Your Landscape with Pollinators in Mind. My name is Kelly Bolter. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator at Milwaukee Public Library. We will just get started in just a moment and just letting everyone join the program here. So just sit tight. Thanks for your patience, and we'll get started momentarily with Melinda Myers. Hello and welcome to everyone that is joining our program here. We'll get started in just a moment with Melinda. We're just giving everyone a couple minutes to join the broadcast, and then we'll get started. All right, so let's get started here. So hello again to everyone. My name is Kelly Bolter. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator at Milwaukee Public Library. Tonight, we are excited to welcome Melinda Myers back again for Maintaining Your Landscape with Pollinators in Mind, which is our third and final broadcast for Pollinator Month, which is June. So joining me tonight is librarian Beth, who will be in the background with me. We will answer questions in the chat and Q&A. We will have time at the end of the program for your questions for Melinda. So please drop those in the Q&A box. And Beth will put a link in the chat to the handout that Melinda will use this evening. So take a look at that and you'll be able to follow along on your computers. Otherwise, with that, we will get started. So I'll hand that over to Melinda.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Beth, and all of you for joining me tonight. It has been an exciting month. Kelly and I were kind of reminiscing about all the planning that went into celebrating Pollinator Month. And I'm so happy you could join me in this final of the 3 webinars for Pollinator Month. And all the recordings are available on the library's website as well. Kelly will give you the details at the end. I always like to thank my sponsors. Because of them, I can offer these webinars for free. And so American Transmission Company and their Grow Smart program are sponsoring this webinar and many of the activities for Pollinator Month. Their Grow Smart program, I teamed up with them because they grow pollinator-friendly plants under their transmission lines, and they want all of us to do the same thing. So they're taking advantage of those long corridors to create habitat that pollinators need, depend upon, and it's beautiful for us to look at and important for them as well. I want to thank Milwaukee Public Library for hosting this event. It makes my job easier. I don't have to worry about the technology. I have their expertise and their help. And then thanks to all the public libraries across the state of Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for participating in Pollinator Month. Many of them have had story times, there are reading lists available, lots of make and take activities, fun things to help all of us celebrate pollinators this month of June. So thanks to all of them as well. And as I mentioned, June is Pollinator Month, and on your handout, there's a link to videos for the whole family to get involved, make a bee house, grow a sunflower. There's still time to plant a container garden for the pollinators. There's still time, and many garden centers still have a few plants, so you can put together some beautiful containers, and then activities for the whole family to get involved. So I hope you'll check those out as well. So how are we going to maintain our landscape with pollinators in mind? Well, let's work with nature. This is my friend Jerry's landscape in the city of Milwaukee, and you can see he's got some cultivated and native plants, jam-packed full of beautiful plants that are supporting pollinators and other beneficial insects. So let's look at ways we can manage our landscape. First of all, we need to keep in mind that 97% of all insects are beneficial. Now, if you're here, you probably already know this, but you can help me spread the word. This was a little praying mantis I found in some parsley in my garden one day, just kind of staring back at me as I was doing some watering and grooming. 97% of all those insects are beneficial. They may be predators like this praying mantis and lady beetles and green lacewings, or they may be pollinators like the bees and decomposers. You know, slugs start decomposing a little too early, but many of the ground beetles break down organic matter, so they help improve the soil. And earthworms, not native, but they do aerate the soil for us. It's the bad jumping worms we want to get rid of. Bees are pollinators, as I mentioned. We had a focus last week on supporting native bees. So if you missed that webinar, check out the recording. Things that we can do, and many more than just our honeybees. But the leafcutter bee eats caterpillars. So not only is it pollinating our plants, but it's also a predator taking care of some of those pollinators. So there's the leafcutter bee taking back the piece of the leaf they snagged from the plant on the right to line their nest as they lay their eggs. Lady beetles, you probably know, eat hundreds of aphids. The larva, which is on the right, kind of doesn't look like the adult, does it? But if you see that, it's a good thing, because the larva eats like 300 to 500 aphids a day. So that's a great way to control those pests that you could see on the left. Green lacewings, you may notice them flitting them around, and then that's their eggs on that stem. They lay their eggs on little filaments and individually, because lacewings are cannibalistic. So by doing this, they give the larva a little bit of space to run away and not be eaten by the others. And so hopefully we'll have lots of them left. And on the right, you see the larva of a green lacewing. They're wonderful insects that eat lots of aphids in the garden. Dragonflies and damselflies eat mosquito larvae, so we really want to encourage them to be in our landscape so that they can help us manage those pesky mosquitoes. And parasitic wasps, when we hear the word wasp, it kind of makes us cringe, and wasps are pollinators, but the parasitic wasp lay their eggs in caterpillars and hornworms and things like that. So you can see the one on the left laying its egg in that caterpillar. When the eggs hatch, they start eating the inside of the caterpillar. And on the right, that's a hornworm. That was in my garden. When the larvae reach full size and they need to pupate, they form those little rice-like pupal cases or cocoons. Then they'll hatch into adult parasitic wasp and then go and treat other caterpillars. So it's nature taking care of a pest. So if you see that hornworm with those little rice granules on their back, that's a good thing. Leave it on the plant. It was eaten alive inside, and those cocoons will hatch into parasitic wasp, and that will continue helping to control the problem. Ground beetles, you often see these in your mulch, and I get lots of calls from people who may be new to using organic mulches, and they'll see the ground beetles and are very worried. They are decomposers, but they do eat a variety of insects as well. And we'll talk a little bit about attracting beneficial insects to the landscape. So that's one way we can manage our landscape, inviting the good guys in to take care of the bad guys. The other way we can reduce problems is the right plant for the growing conditions. This is a true red maple. Now, some people call the Norway maple, with bigger, blockier leaves that are kind of a reddish purple all summer long, a red maple. But the true red maple, Acer rubrum, that you see here, has green leaves in the summer and red in the fall. Perfectly happy in central and northern Wisconsin, where the soils are acidic. But in southern Wisconsin, we have a high pH soil, so iron and manganese needed by the plants is tied up in the soil. We get chlorosis, that yellowing of the leaves. Changing pH is difficult, so planting the right plant and the location where you're growing is going to save you a lot of headaches. Healthier plants are more resistant to pests. I added this last minute because last week somebody reminded me that healthy soil is the key to a healthy garden. And hopefully you've got good soil, but most of us end up with either heavy clay, disturbed sites because of construction, or I'm in sand and rocky country right now. And so adding organic matter to the soil is one way to do it. A couple of inches worked into the top 12 inches of soil is going to give you some good, quick results. There are no dig methods you could do as well. Those take a little bit longer to implement. So maybe for next year, you'll look at lasagna gardening or hugelkultur gardening or some of the no dig methods. I just finished a blog from Milorganite. It probably will be posted within the next couple of weeks on no dig gardening. So if you're looking at, I don't want to do the compost thing, I want to look for no dig so I minimize my disturbance of the soil structure and the soil health. But a healthy foundation is critical for healthy plant growth, which means fewer problems. Proper care. We've had some extreme heat throughout the state and throughout much of the United States, and a lot of wind, which is drying out our soil and our plants. So watering is very important. Water thoroughly, but make sure you don't do little bits of water every day. Water thoroughly and less frequently to encourage good deep roots. Now, new plantings, especially with this hot weather, are going to need more attention. Check them every few days. Once established, a good soaking once a week is usually enough in clay soil, twice a week in sandy, rocky soil. But again, temperature, wind speeds may influence that. If you can water right at the soil line with a soaker hose or drip irrigation, you're going to waste less water. And then if you're going to fertilize, do a soil test first. I know not everyone's going to be able to do that, but by testing the soil, you'll find out how much and what type, if any, fertilizer is needed. And that's a great way to be kind to the environment and not waste money buying product you don't need and using the right fertilizer for the plants you're growing. The University Extension Service offers soil testing in their state soil testing lab. Just go online and it'll give you the directions on how to how to test the soil, how to take the sample, and where to send it. It's a great way to find out what's existing in your soil so you know what you need to add. So let's adjust some of our maintenance practices now. So we've got that foundation set. We've got some ideas of plant selection. How are we going to maintain it? Lawns are a big part of landscapes. They help provide walkways, play areas for kids and adults and families. They are the backdrop. They create a great palette for your flower beds. But how much lawns do you really need? Take a look at your landscape and decide how much you really need and how you want to manage it. Many of you may have done No Mow May, or many of you may be contemplating it for next year. And I thought, even though we're past May, it was a great program to make people aware of pollinators. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the purpose and managing your lawns after the effect. So the idea of No Mow May was to raise our mowing height so that many of the early blooming plants would flower for the bees to come and get the pollen and the nectar they need. Because many of our pollinators are out early, and some of our more cultivated and formal gardens may not have flowers blooming, but there are those things in the lawn that many of the pollinators need: clovers, dandelions, things like that. So by raising the mowing height or eliminating mowing early in the season, we're allowing those to flower so those early pollinators have a source of food. Now, No Mow May, a couple things to keep in mind. Make sure it's allowed in your municipality. Some have regulations on the height of the grass. So if you let your lawn go, you may get a ticket. You need to talk to your neighbors to make sure they know what you're doing. Elm Grove Beautification Committee did a great job, not only of working with their village board to make sure this was going to be acceptable, but creating signs that people could put in their lawn. So their neighbors understood why their grass was so tall and that it wasn't being neglected, or that their neighbors were on vacation and forgot to hire someone to cut the grass. If you are using herbicides, you're killing all those plants that we need to let flower for No Mow May. So you may want to do a pollinator garden, expand your planting beds for some early blooming perennials instead. Once May has passed, and a lot of you have already started this process, you have to gradually reduce your mowing height. Because if you go from, I saw some lawns that were 12 inches or more tall, if you go down to 3 inches right away, that's very stressful on the lawn. So mowing as high as possible and gradually reducing that height is going to be less stressful on your lawn. And then make sure your mower blade is sharp. And yes, I do need to clean my deck of my mower, but a sharp blade makes clean cuts so your lawn looks better. Those wounds close more quickly. So you lose less water, less risk of disease. You can save, I think it's 25, you'll use 25% less water with when you use a sharp blade, and about 22% less fuel, and you'll save time because that lawnmower can cut more quickly through the grass. Those are all benefits of sharpening your blade. And usually when I'm speaking in person, I look out at the audience and I can see people going, I'm supposed to sharpen my blade. So what we do is we have several blades on hand. I have lots of rocks, as I mentioned, so I get a lot of nicks and cut, damage to my blade. So this way I can swap them out and take them to have them sharpened and still always have a sharp blade on hand. Fertilize. Hopefully you did your fertilization around Memorial Day. So I'm a big believer in the holiday fertilization schedule. Memorial Day, so you get your lawn off to a good start before the hot, dry weather kicks in. Labor Day to help it recover from the heat of the summer. And then around Halloween so that you get that last bit of growth when your lawn is spreading and filling in. And I'm a fan of Milorganite. I work with them, so I want to disclose that. But it's low nitrogen, slow release. So if you fertilized your lawn in late May, early June, and we've had these horrendous temperatures, it just sits in the soil until the moisture and temperature is right for plants to grow. The fertilizer is then available for the plants to use. It won't burn your lawn. Or use some other low nitrogen, slow release fertilizer to avoid those problems. Maybe you want to change some of your lawn to a bee lawn. Now, I have grandkids, so I've got to have areas for them to run and play, but I am letting some areas go so that I have clover and the self-healed, some of those other perennial plants that the bees need and love. And a lot of people are converting their lawns to clover lawns, are more drought tolerant and lower maintenance. So a couple things on your handout and some links to some information. You may want to switch your lawn grass to more of a fine fescue mix, one of the no-mow mixes. That way you can either avoid mowing, maybe once a month. You can let it go longer, and that makes it a lot easier to manage. And that way you can let those low-growing perennials like the clover, the creeping thyme, the self-heal that many people are using in their bee gardens, they bloom a little bit lower so you can mow as high as possible when you do need to mow, allowing them to bloom so the pollinators have some source of nectar and pollen. I said I promised I'd mention some plants that attract beneficial insects. You're probably growing lots of these. Members of the carrot family, those things that have that umbel of flowers. And you can see a little, I think there's a little bee down there. These small flowers really invite a lot of the parasitic wasp into the garden. Your carrot family, dill and fennel, support swallowtail butterfly caterpillars as well, and so does cilantro. So having those in your garden, one, you probably are using your dill and fennel and cilantro, but also you're helping to bring those beneficial insects to the garden so that they manage some of those pests. Beautiful plants like goldenrod, sunflower, coreopsis, members of the aster family not only attract bees and butterflies, and many of them attract hummingbirds, but also some of those insects, flies, and other native bees, and things that also help manage our pests. The mustard family, Sweet Alyssum, is one of the plants that you probably grow and never think about it being in the mustard family. Nice fragrance. It helps support many predaceous insects, arugula and broccoli. I did a blog for Milorganite on companion planting, and I think it was the University of Minnesota had done research and found that if you're trying to manage, use plants to control plant pests, planting spicy members of the mustard family like arugula attracts some of the cabbage worms and aphids so they don't attack the broccoli and cabbage. The problem is if you want to eat arugula, then you're going to have insects on there. But there's some good information on research that talks about research companion planting, whether it's to improve the soil, to manage pests, or other benefits that planting certain plants together can provide. The mint family, some of them are rather aggressive. Creeping thyme, if you've ever let it bloom, lots of bees visiting it. Both are native as well as honeybees. The anise hyssop is visited by bees and wasps and flies and butterflies as well, and monarda and lavender. So lots of insects are going to come and enjoy those flowers that you're enjoying as well. But if you want good guys to come to the garden, you need to tolerate some pests. So if you kill all the aphids, the lady beetles are going somewhere else to dine. So it's that fine line between, okay, we're going to manage the pests when the populations are small, but we're going to let nature come in and take care of them. One of my favorite aphid stories is when my daughter was little and I was living in the city of Milwaukee, I had a goldenrod. It was being attacked by aphids. And every night when I'd pick her up from the babysitter and I'd come home and I'd go, boy, there's aphids on that goldenrod. I need to do something. Well, of course, I'm a procrastinator. So lo and behold, the lady beetles moved in to eat the aphids. It was the hit of the summer garden. My daughter made all her friends go look at the aphid plant, as she called it, and the lady beetles munching on the aphids. They took care of the problem for me. Plus, it was a great lesson for my daughter and all the kids in the neighborhood that there are good guys in the garden that we want to take care of. So then the next question that I always get is, what about buying and releasing beneficial insects? Is it worth the money? There are some companies that sell beneficial insects. And really the bottom line is, when you release them, a lot of times they leave your yard and go take care of others' yards. So first of all, you need to have food for them to eat, right? So otherwise they're going elsewhere. But they're, when they break out of dormancy, that's their first instinct to do. And so if you are going to buy them, make sure you release them at dusk. Make sure you have a food source. But better yet, invite those beneficial insects in. I did a webinar or a show for Wisconsin Lawn and Garden, and Dr. Dan Marr from the University of Wisconsin was my guest, and I had ordered egg cases of praying mantids, and I had lacewings, and we were doing a show on beneficial insects, and I still see students from that production going, remember when all those green lacewings were buzzing around the studio? Well, the egg masses, I took one up to the campus where I was teaching and put it in the greenhouse, and I put one in a house plant in my house. Nothing happened for months. And then one morning, I'm getting ready to go to work, and there were hundreds of baby praying mantids all over my kitchen wall. Well, they're cannibalistic, so I got off all the Tupperware and I'm putting a dozen in each one to take up to work to release in the greenhouse. Thought I got them all. Came home, my family's standing there, arms crossed, and said, "We found your friends." So apparently not all of them had escaped the egg mass and were on my white kitchen wall. My family wasn't too happy, but it was a great moment of watching them hatch, but I did learn my lesson, not in the kitchen. Don't forget about those songbirds. They do a lot to help us. On the left is a hummingbird nectaring on my cardinal climber. I also have a major wheeler honeysuckle, cultivar of our native honeysuckle vine, and my hummingbird feeder is there. And I'll watch the hummingbird nectar from this feeder, nectar on the lilac that's also there in the spring, and then on the major wheeler honeysuckle vine. And then I'll find them eating some of those aphids off the stem of the major wheeler honeysuckle. So it's helping manage the pest. Songbirds, the majority of them eat insects, and it's a great source of protein for them, especially during the mating and breeding season, early spring and early into the summer when we really want to manage those pests. On the right is a bird feeding off of purple Majesty millet. I was at a tour of Ball Horticulture in West Chicago, and that was the year they introduced this. And I walked up and there were tons of birds feeding on the seeds. I took a picture and they kind of scattered, and then they'd come back to feed, and then someone else would come and take a picture and they'd scattered. It was amazing to watch them eat the seeds. So having nature provide the food means you don't have to clean and fill the feeder. It's a much safer option. Or maybe add a bird bath and make sure it's clean and filled with fresh water. Really important now. Toads and frogs, excellent. They eat lots of insects. You could make a toad abode, and there's some information and links from on the handout to the webinar, the video I did on making a toad abode with my grandkids. A saucer with water and a couple stones. Again, now with the heat And the dry conditions, making sure they have water is going to be helpful. I tuck this under some shrubs, so there's lots of insects for them to eat. It's kind of nice and shady and cool, and there's water for them. It's not too far from where I have containers, so I'm always watering those every day, and I can check to make sure they have the water they needed. So how are we going to manage our gardens beyond this? Leaf litter. The days of a clean, neat, and tidy garden, I think more and more of us are understanding the importance of tolerating a little leaf litter. If you have a landscape company come to work for you, you may want to talk to them. You know, they're used to customers wanting to see the soil, but in reality, leaving that leaf litter is a great way to provide habitat. It's home for many beneficial insects. It's also insulation for insects, toads, and frogs that overwinter underneath the soil. And then as this breaks down, it improves the soil as well. So you're leaving that material on your garden instead of hauling it away, less work, and you're providing good soil amendments as well. Allow healthy perennials to stand for winter. This is one of my gardens at my house right now. The winter interest is wonderful. It provides food for many birds, and a lot of beneficial insects overwinter in the stems of those plants. So leave them stand for winter. You know, we're in Wisconsin, so this is just, you know, winter interest for us. And then wait to cut them back. We want to wait until there's a lot of different varying recommendations, 3 or 5 days at 50-degree temperatures. That's when many of the beneficial insects leave those stems. Now, sometimes we can't wait. We have that one day we can clean up, or things are starting to grow. We don't have time. Maybe stack them out of sight. So if you do need to cut back your garden and you're worried there are still maybe some beneficial insects in the stem, stack those stems out of sight. That'll give them a chance to exit in case they are there. And then midsummer to late summer, chop them up and use them as mulch or throw them in the compost pile. The other thing, I think we're all learning more and more about how we can support our pollinators. The University of Minnesota, when I was doing some research for Pollinator Month, I came across their recommendations. And besides cutting back, as I mentioned, and stacking out of sight, they also mentioned leaving some stem stubble. So that leaving some of the stems 8 to 24 inches tall on your plant, so cutting some of them back, leaving those open stems makes it easier for some of those beneficial insects to lay eggs for the current season. And then next year, by the time they exit, that debris is going to fall down. Your new growth will mask that stubble, so you won't be looking at this later in the season. So leaving some of those stems stand, create or provide homes, new homes for beneficial insects for the current year. And then if you have logs that have fallen down or trees dropping or branches, even dead branches, and you know it's not a hazard or a risk to the health of the tree or you all, you may want to leave them stand. Now in the city, I could put some branches and things in the back in my garden, but it wasn't really practical in my tiny city lot. But it is where I live now. So if you've got space, you may want to leave some of those logs. As they decompose, they add nutrients to the soil. They provide homes for insects that bring in birds and predaceous insects. And so it's creating this whole ecosystem that supports plant growth and controlling and managing pests. And brush piles. Yes, this is a place that rabbits do hide, but so do fox, who manage some of our wildlife, but also birds. You'll find birds in your brush piles because there's lots of insects in there for them to eat, and then good insects as well as those that are harmful. So let's talk a little bit about managing some pests, because we've done all of this and hopefully it all works out well. But you know what? Nature sometimes has different plans, or our growing conditions are not as kind to our plants as we'd like. So first of all, monitor your garden. Go out and visit as you're weeding or maybe watering. Look under the leaves, along the stems. If you're putting out yellow sticky traps, make sure the birds can't get at those insects. Sometimes there have been some reports of birds getting stuck on that tanglefoot. So sometimes covering them with a little bit of wire so the insect can get it there, but the bird can't. Or just checking your plants, because the smaller the population, the easier it is to manage. You need to properly identify the problem. So on the left, we have spruce. It's an adelgid, an aphid-like insect that feeds on the spruce that causes these growths. And you can see little holes. And so when they exit, that kills the tip of the spruce. Doesn't really hurt the overall health of the plant, but it does look bad. For small plants, you can just prune those out, get rid of them. As the plant gets bigger, it's not very practical, and the plant has way more needles to support the growth than what's been damaged. On the right, that looks very similar, but this was frost damage. So we've had some growth, some new growth that came out. We got a cold snap and it damaged those stems. So obviously no control needed. And then looking at the weather, so hostas. Sometimes we get a late spring frost. So when your hosta is emerging, you get some brown tips on it. But the new growth isn't affected. The damage stopped. So it's more environmental. In the late summer, often hostas growing in sunny locations will develop scorch. And that's because that soil is too dry. They really prefer some shade. If they're in the sun, the moisture level is very important. So again, monitoring the weather and the time of year not only will help you diagnose, but if you need to ask someone for help, that's going to help them help you diagnose the problem. And then your maintenance, mulch piled over the trunk of trees, stems of plants, the crown of plants can lead to root rot, can increase the risk of voles coming and feeding, adventitious roots, girdling roots, it'll just strangle that tree. So make sure that the maintenance you're doing is promoting healthy growth. And then you need to decide, is control even needed? These are galls, and spraying them will do no good. Not needed, first of all, but it won't do any good. So here's the deal. A couple of different mites feed on the leaves of maples as they're expanding. You'll see galls on oaks and hackberry and other plants as well. So the insects feed on the developing leaves. The plant forms that growth over the insect, actually protecting it, because their feeding causes that proliferation of cells and you get that gall forming. So if you were going to go to control it, it would do no good. You may feel better, but it won't do any good. So timing is critical, but again, there's no need to treat. Predaceous insects often take care of it. We'll see spikes of insect problems and then the populations will drop. So we'll see this some years and not others. So do you really need to control it? Is it worth spraying the plant, the money, the time, and the impact on the environment? Not for that problem. Is the pest even present? I see a lot of rose sawfly damage. This insect usually attacks roses in early June in Wisconsin, and people would bring me baggies with the damaged leaves, but the insect was already gone. And so spraying wasn't necessary and not helpful. This is not a slug. They call it a rose slug because it looks kind of slug-like, but it's actually a sawfly. And we'll talk about managing sawflies. But really, by the time you notice the damage, these guys are almost mature size. They're almost done feeding. So it's kind of pointless to do any treatment. Is it harmful enough to treat? This guy looks pretty scary, this big guy, and it will eat leaves, but one or two on a plant, usually just hand picking, or these are fun because you can put it in a jar, feed it a little bit, and watch it turn into this big, huge moth. But you need to decide, is the damage it's doing worth treating? And maybe hand picking is enough. When I was working on a book, The Ultimate Garden Guide for Birds in Bloom, my editor goes, well, I grew up in Ohio, so did I. And she said, we'd burn them. And I said, and I bet your trees didn't look too good when you were done. And well, not really. So the cure was worse than the problem. So again, make sure that they're causing enough damage to warrant treatment, and the treatment doesn't hurt them. Box elder bugs, very annoying. They feed on the seeds of maples, and box elder is a type of maple. Where they're annoying to us is usually in the fall. They congregate usually on the south or west side of a house where it's nice and warm, usually the south side, and they congregate often at the door. You try to run in so they don't get inside. You can just use a soap and water solution. Make sure it doesn't harm your siding, because that that side of your house might be a little lighter than the other 3 sides, or just tolerate the damage. But again, it's more of an annoyance. It doesn't hurt the maples that it eats the seeds. We wish that some of those seeds would be harmed so we'd have fewer Norway maple seedlings in our gardens. And then is it just plain ugly? This is dog vomit fungus, and you can tell that's a perfect name. I get calls saying things like, the deer ate so many of my plants, they got sick, or the neighbor's dog is throwing up in my garden. This is a slime mold, and it feeds on organic matter. So we often see it on wood chip mulch, cocoa bean mulch. When the mulch stays moist, the slime mold forms. I've seen it slime up the side of plants, but it doesn't harm them. Dry weather arrives, it dries up and dies. You can also lightly rake, lightly rake your mulches when weather is gray and cold. And that will prevent it from forming. It doesn't harm anything, but it is certainly disgusting looking, that is. And then eco-friendly pest management options. And we're going to talk about a few. Even if you're using organic and natural pest control, always read and follow label directions. They are designed to kill things, and that means they could kill good guys as well as the problem insects. And then once you have a problem, make a note on your calendar so you watch for it next year. If you decide to do some kind of control, make a note, adjust your control as needed, and record it for the future. I always told my students when I was teaching, getting old as a gardener is a good thing, except for the knees and the back, because the more seasons under your belt, the more you know how to manage your plants. You've experienced more challenges and see how resilient plants can be. So here are just a few examples. First, let's talk a little bit about why diseases occur. First of all, you need a plant that's susceptible. That's your host. The environment needs to be favorable for the disease we're worried about. You know, cool, wet springs lead to a lot of disease, fungal disease problems. Powdery mildew is very common in very droughty seasons. And then you need the pathogen, the fungus, the fungi, the bacteria, the virus has to be present. When all 3 are present, that's when a disease occurs. So you pull one of those away, you eliminate the problem. We can't control the weather, but we may be able to do some things to minimize the population of the pathogen or not grow plants that are susceptible to common diseases. Hopefully you're not seeing this in your garden, but it's a common problem on lilacs, monarda like you see here, phlox, and a variety of plants. There are different strains of powdery mildew fungus that attack different plants. So one thing, use resistant plants. When you're looking for monarda or you're looking for phlox, you may opt for a cultivar of one of our native varieties that's more resistant to powdery mildew. Make sure they receive proper growing conditions, enough space so they get airflow and light penetration to reduce the risk. Make sure that they're in the right amount of sunlight and they have space. Thin out the stems in the spring of your phlox and powder and your monarda. Take out about 1/4 of those stems. That will open things up so you have better airflow, better light penetration, again, reducing the risk. And I'm kind of a lazy gardener, and if I have maybe a plant that's sentimental, a phlox I've had for years, or a monarda a friend gave me, instead of doing anything to, like thinning or getting rid of it or replacing it, I'll just put something a little shorter in front to mask the diseased leaves, but still be able to see the flowers. And, if you've suffered with powdery mildew, those plants will come back. You could do the Cornell University baking soda cure. They did research and they started with cucumbers and found that baking soda will help reduce the risk or help manage powdery mildew. You'll see various types of formulas for this. This is the one from UW Extension. So they recommend 1.5 tablespoons of baking soda, 3 tablespoons of a lightweight horticulture oil or insecticidal soap that acts as a spread or sticker. Mix that into a gallon of water. You start at the first sign of powdery mildew and you have to repeat once a week. Now you probably see why I just opt to live with it and mask the damage. I think it was Colorado State University found that horticulture oils, lightweight horticulture oils like Summit year-round spray oil, provided up to 30 days of control. So that may be an option for you as well. And so those are just some things for powdery mildew. What about Phytophthora and Botrytis blight? We see this a lot on peonies and white and pink roses. So the blight can prevent the flower buds from opening. So they look like this and you get spotting on the leaves. So sanitation is one thing. So get rid of the diseased part, throw it in the garbage. Most municipalities allow you to throw small quantities of diseased plant material in the trash. You may want to check first. And that's one way to manage it. You can use organic fungicides, copper-containing fungicides, and those are needed to be applied preventatively, so before you see the problem. And that's why fungicides are so tricky. So you're like, am I going to have a problem this year? Are the weather conditions right? Have I had a problem in the past? Am I going to take a chance and not treat and not have the disease? Or do I want to, make sure I don't have a problem? You also want to clean up your peonies in the fall and all the fallen infected leaves off your roses as well. So fall cleanup, that gets rid of the source of disease for next year, or at least some of it. Clean up as the disease occurs. And then if you're going to use a fungicide, you need to do it preventatively. Aphids. So we're going to switch gears a little bit to insects and aphids, or plant lice. They come in a variety of colors. There's black and peach and green. And on the left, you can see some yellow aphids. And aphids suck plant juices. They secrete the excess as a clear sticky substance called honeydew. And you can see an ant on one of those milkweed leaves. And that ant is actually feeding on the honeydew. So if you see a lot of ants, you probably see clear sticky substance, and then you're going to end up finding those aphids. The white thread-like things are the cast exoskeleton, sorry. So as aphids and other insects grow, they cast their old exoskeleton, the part that holds them together, as the new one forms. And so that's the exoskeleton of the aphid. In the middle, you'll see sooty mold. So I mentioned the aphids suck plant juices, secrete the excess, and that clear sticky substance, a fungi called sooty mold, grows on the honeydew. It's not on the plant, it's actually on the honeydew. Now, how it harms the plant is it blocks the sunlight from reaching the leaf, and that can cause some yellowing. Plus, we also have the aphid feeding that's caused the damage. So a strong blast of water, soapy water, will also not only take care of the aphids, but then take care of that sooty mold. And I see this quite a bit on my milkweed. And then just a close up on the left, looking at some of them. Lacewings and lady beetles will feed on aphids. Mites also suck plant juices, secrete the excess as honeydew. You can start to see some webbings here. They're feeding because their mouth parts are like needles, causes a speckling on the leaves. If you see the webbing, boy, the populations are pretty high. So for me, when I start seeing that bronzing on the leaf, I'll often feel, and I could feel kind of the grittiness from the exoskeletons. Maybe get out a hand lens. They're very tiny and hard to see. Some people like to take a white sheet of paper, shake the leaf over it, and you can see those mites scurrying across. There are predatory mites that actually eat the spider mites as well. So again, nature stepping in to help us. But if you can't wait for nature, a strong blast of water will dislodge many of the mites and aphids. We tend to see more problems when it's hot and dry, less rain. And so that knocks them off the plant. And sometimes that's enough to keep the populations at a level the plants can tolerate. Insecticidal soap and horticulture oil will also kill those. Now, these are organic treatments. They are contact insecticides. And that means that when we spray them, it has to contact the insect because it coats the insect and it prevents them from breathing because they have holes in their body, their exoskeleton, where they exchange oxygen. So if we plug those up with the soap or the oil, they end up suffocating and dying. They can also do the same for beneficial insects. So you want to be careful when using these. But the good news is if you treat your plant and a lady beetle walks over or praying mantid visits later, it won't hurt them because it has to contact the insect it's killing. And then traps and reflective mulches can work for aphids. So a yellow bowl filled with soapy water, the yellow attracts the aphids, they crash and they drown. I was reading some research that reflective mulches will do the same. And so basically, I don't know how they figured it out. The aphids, they navigate by the sky. So they see the sky above and reflected in the mulch below. They crash into the mulch and die. So when I was working with Extension, the master gardeners and I put down some foil in between our plants. And the next morning, there were foil balls. So I had to find some heavier duty foil. And there are some silver mulches out on the market. And we used it, and we really found that more of them died on the reflective mulch than in the yellow trap. But who wants reflective mulches in your garden? But I thought it was a fun thing to try. Earwigs. Now I deal with a lot of insects, but even these kind of give me the creeps. They do not crawl into your ear and eat your brains like you saw in Star Trek, or maybe have heard rumors about, but they do pinch if they're cornered. They're not going to go after you. And they are predaceous. So in the UK, they often use earwig traps, and they hang those in their trees because the earwigs eat codling moth larvae. So that's a good thing about them. The bad thing is they eat holes in a variety of plants, and they tend to feed at night just like slugs, leaving holes. So you often see the damage and not the insect. So you can use traps, terracotta pot with crumpled paper underneath. They collect in the paper, throw it in a can of soapy water, and that works well. You can also use insecticides to treat them. Organic ones like pyrethrins, which is a plant-based product as well. So those are some options that you can try. Slugs. Slugs and snails. They like cool, dark, damp conditions, much like our earwigs. They usually slime up on the plant at night, leaving a little slime trail. They eat holes in the leaves. They love hostas. They'll eat a variety of plants, and then they slime down to hide in the shade during the day. So I always like to ask gardeners, how do you manage slugs? I had a woman when I was working for Extension call me and she said, well, I need some tips for managing slugs. There's got to be an easier way. And I said, well, what are you doing? And she said, I'm using scissors to cut them in half. Well, that worked, but it was a little cumbersome and time consuming. So I said, we've got a solution for you, and I'll talk about those in a minute. I got another call from a gentleman who put boards in between his plants. And this is a great strategy because what happens is the slugs crawl under the board in the morning to escape the sunlight. They attach to the board. You could turn it upside down, knock them into soapy water. Some people like to sprinkle salt on them, throw them into a can of beer if that makes you happy, smash them. So one guy, he said, well, he would do this, and then he'd take his boards, put them slug side up on the driveway, and drive over them with his car. So a little bit of anger issues, perhaps effective, but a little overkill, I think. And I was quoted in a newspaper when my daughter was young, and I went to during recess to help with recess, and her teacher came up and goes, do you want to know how I control slugs? And I said, not really, not till my daughter's out of school. So boards will work, other ways to trap them. Look for resistant plants. A lot of our hostas with the thicker leaves are more slug resistant, like Innis woods and Abiqua drinking gourd. Look at those thick leaves. That's one way, or just live with the damage. Toads, inviting toads into the landscape. The toad abode on the left, just tuck it in a place so they have a nice, cool, dark, damp place. Those broken terracotta pots don't need to be tossed out. They make great toad abodes. Again, providing a good environment, they'll help take care of the slugs for you. And then slug traps. Stale beer really does work. We sink it into the ground so it's easy for them to get into the trap, and then they end up dying in there. On the left, that's a little slug trap from Gardener Supply. It looks like a piece of garden art. So it's a little more attractive than that bowl of stale beer on the right. There's a hole in the base so the slug crawls inside and the beer is inside. Now the benefit, this has a roof, so you're not replacing the beer every time it rains. Master Gardener taught me a trick. He said he would empty half a bottle of beer any way you want, then lay it on its side and tuck it under the hostas or the plants. The slugs really do crawl inside that bottle, because I did do this, and then they die. And then you've got your built-in roof as well. So the slug traps with beer really work. Diatomaceous earth, eggshells, even some research was done out of the Pacific Northwest that quackgrass would cut through those bodies and deter them, but who wants to encourage any more quackgrass? And I put a question mark after coffee grounds. I had read some, I thought, reliable sources that said coffee grounds would help discourage slugs. Jeff Gilman, who wrote a great book, The Truth and Myths About Garden Remedies and The Truth and Myths About Organic Gardening, tested a lot of them, and he didn't find good results with coffee grounds. But when I shared with him the research I'd seen, he goes, well, maybe I need to check it again. My theory is if you got coffee grounds, you're going to improve the soil, but don't count on it to control the slugs. Diatomaceous earth does work. These little diatoms, don't get the swimming pool ones, but get the ones designed for the garden, cut through their bodies, and they end up dying. But when it rains, you need to replace the eggshells in the diatomaceous earth. An organic control like Sluggo, Escargot, I think Bonide has one, where the active ingredient is iron phosphate. It's an organic control. And OMRI, when you see that on the label, it's Organic Materials Research Institute, and they test products. And if they receive that, then you know it is truly an organic product. So what happens is these are little pellets, you sprinkle them around on the ground. The slug or snail eats that iron phosphate. It's a stomach poison. They slime away and die. If a bird eats the slug that's been poisoned or a toad, it won't hurt them. So that's one of the good things about this. Most slug baits are very, very toxic. So make sure that you're getting an organic product if you opt for that control. Cabbage worms, holes in leaves of broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage plants. There you can see the worms, the adults on the right-hand side, a white moth. They are imported and they're from Europe, so they're not native. So one of my friends used to pay the neighborhood kids $1/4 a cabbage worm moth, and he'd send them out with badminton rackets to knock those down and kill them. Hand picking on the left when you see those caterpillars. I always try to check my broccoli and cabbage before I cook and serve because I have found a little extra protein on the dinner plate. My family's not so happy. So besides killing the moth, looking for the eggs and smashing them or removing the caterpillars when they're found, you start seeing holes, it's time to pay attention. You can prevent the damage by covering the plants using a lightweight row cover. These are fabrics that let air, light, and water through. They're great for extending the season. They trap the heat, but the lightweight ones are excellent for pest control. They prevent the adult from laying the eggs on the plant. So the adult can't get to the plant. You don't have any cabbage worms. So it's a great way to prevent problems. I have a row of cabbage outside in my garden. I peeked under the row cover because I've been seeing the cabbage moths, and I got it covered at planting. So I know that the moths can't get to it, and they're looking pretty good. If you didn't get them covered, or you're starting to see damage and you're not sure you handpicked them all, you can use an organic. Bacillus Thuringiensis crustacei is naturally occurring soil bacteria, and this strain kills the larvae of caterpillars, true caterpillars. Now, fortunately, it's just the cabbage worm that attacks the cabbage, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts. So you're not harming the others when you apply this to your cabbage plants. The good news is you can treat it. When the caterpillars eat it, they stop feeding, and over time they disintegrate and die. And you can go ahead and harvest right away, just rinse off so you don't get any of that gritty BT. And that's a great way to manage them if you've missed your chance to block them from the plants. Sawflies, they look very similar to caterpillars, don't they? This is the Columbine Sawfly, and I'll tell you, I get calls on this. My Columbine was fine, and now it's just nothing but stalks. It seems like they eat overnight. The Sawflies, the adult is a fly. The larva is a worm-like larva, like you see here, similar to a caterpillar. But here's the difference. Caterpillars have 5 or fewer pairs of prolegs. So they have the real legs in the front and then those fake legs in the middle. Sawflies, on the other hand, have 6 or 8 pairs of prolegs. So spell out sawfly. If you've got that many or more fake legs, you can see the real ones in the front, then you know it's a sawfly. Why does this matter? Because BTK, that bacillus that will control caterpillars, will not control sawfly. So you want to make sure you properly identify the insect so you don't waste the chemical on something that won't die from that treatment. So with sawflies, you can physically remove. There's a European pine sawfly that attacks a variety of pines, and they often feed in colonies, and they're kind of wild. If you put your hand up, they kind of do this little dance, and they usually do one branch at a time. So a leather glove, just go and smash them. You can prune out that one branch. They tend to go from branch to branch to branch. They don't eat the new growth because they want to make sure that there'll be food for them next year, but those are some options. So physically removing them. The good thing about Columbine Sawfly, even if they eat the whole plant, your Columbine will send up fresh new growth and will be able to tolerate the damage. It's just a little disheartening when they do this while their Columbine is blooming. Soaps and horticulture oils will work, but you want to get them when they're young because the bigger the larva, the less effective these organic products are. Japanese beetles. Yuck, right? They feed on over 300 different species of plants. If you don't have them in your landscape, I'm happy to hear it. I have people call these the love bugs because as you can see, they mate in broad daylight. They eat the tissue between the veins, so it's a lacy looking kind of damage. They'll eat leaves, they'll eat flowers, and cannas, grapes, raspberries, roses, a variety of plants, and they can be a little overwhelming. So a couple things to keep in mind. Here is their life cycle. The adults feed above ground. And so depending on where you live, in Wisconsin, it's usually late June, July timeframe. When the adults are done feeding, usually in August, they'll lay their eggs. But I have seen some adults out in October even. So they lay their eggs, usually in grassy areas, but the eggs will hatch. You'll get grubs. The grubs feed on the roots of grass plants and some other plants. They feed on those plants. Then they go deeper in the soil to overwinter where it's a little more protected. In the spring, they start moving up as the soil warms. They pupate, turn into beetles, come out of the ground, and then start feeding on those 300 different plants. Now, if you treat your lawn, that will kill the grubs, but the adults can fly up to 2 miles. So it won't necessarily manage the adults for you. So just keep that in mind, how they feed and how they can fly the adults to attack those 300 plants. University of Minnesota found that if you catch the first invaders in your landscape and take care of them, that fewer of their friends will come to join them. I thought they sent a signal, but really what's happening is the more insects, the more damage, the more chemical signal they send out to other beetles to come. There's good eats here, and they end up feeding on your plants. Now, that means you've got to watch. So starting right now, actually in Wisconsin, I didn't see any. I was looking in my garden. I haven't seen any yet. But, and you've got to get out and you've got to start dealing with them early. Okay, so if you knock them into a can of soapy water or vacuum them up early, fewer of them will follow. That means less to manage and less damage. I took this picture at Old Brook Botanic Garden because I thought it was just a great reminder that they just manage the beetles by hand because they don't want to use pesticides. And this was in their cannas, and boy, I had Japanese beetles wipe out my cannas, but they wanted people to understand there were a few holes that volunteers and staff, when they had time, would knock them into cans of soapy water and take care of them that way rather than using sprays. In fact, when I was doing some work with Great Lakes Gardener in Michigan, they call it Japanese lace. They've had Japanese beetles longer. So some of the horticulturists were like, well, we'll just deal with it and let the damage happen on plants that could tolerate it. But I understand when they devastated my cannas in front of my house, it was very upsetting. So what else can we do? So don't use Japanese beetle traps. And I wanted to mention them. They will attract Japanese beetles, but they'll bring them to your yard. and don't give them to your neighbor. That's not a nice thing to do. And I know some people talk about putting them away from their garden to trap the beetles. And I have people tell me, well, I've captured thousands of them. I'm sure you have, because it emits a pheromone that brings the beetles into your yard. So really, it's not recommended to use. Milky spore powder is a product that we apply to the soil to handle the grubs. It only kills the grubs of Japanese beetles. There are other grubs that feed on plants and feed on roots in the garden, but it will kill the grubs. Now, here's the deal. It takes 3 years for this disease to build up in your soil to kill the grubs. You've got to have some grubs for that disease to feed upon, so it could grow and multiply. No insecticides or fungicides can be applied to the lawn for that 3-year period. So keep that in mind. And the other thing, remember, the adults fly up to 2 miles. So if you can get the whole neighborhood to work on this method, that might be a good solution as well. The product in the middle is relatively new, Beetle Gone, also Beetle Juice, J-U-S. You can tell how old people are that are introducing these products and marketing them. It's BTG, Bacillus Thuringiensis Galleria, and it's a strain of that bacteria, that's naturally occurring soil bacteria that kills the larvae and adults of Japanese beetles and other beetles. I did purchase some last year. I didn't get it until late because I had to mail order it. So I'm hoping this year I'll be able to treat in a more timely manner. Now, the downside is it tells you it treats a variety of beetles, but there's not a good consistent list. So again, use it carefully because we don't want to kill any of the good guys. But if you've got Japanese beetles, and just those are the only beetles, so if you've got, ladybugs, it supposedly doesn't control or doesn't harm. But if you've got Japanese beetles, but you've got butterflies and bees visiting your plant, this won't harm them. So it's Bacillus thuringiensis Galleria, sold as Beetle Gone and Beetle Juice. I've only seen it available mail order. Scale, hard-shelled scale. So the insect it sucks plant juices. You may see clear, sticky substance, the honeydew, because they secrete the excess. What happens is the little crawlers, the eggs hatch, the crawlers look for a place to eat. They start feeding and form this hard shell over the top. Many overwinter that way as eggs. So the females will lay eggs. And if we try to spray them with most insecticides, it won't kill them. So it's oyster shell scale it's a hemispherical scale on the left, and on the right is pine needle scale. Usually a problem on mugo pines in urban areas. I have mugo pines. I'm out in the country, and I had some pine needle scale. I think it came with the plants when I bought them. I didn't notice it. And the birds took care of the problem for me. So I was very lucky. I never sprayed. But in urban areas, you might not be so lucky. So options for controlling scale: physically remove. Sometimes people will take an old toothbrush. I have scale on my lilac. It's a standard. And so I've used an oyster shell scale, just an old toothbrush to kind of loosen those shells. You can use insecticidal soap or horticulture oils when the crawlers are active. And so a lot of our universities are telling us, instead of apply in mid-June, they'll say apply when the Van Hoot spirea are blooming. And on your handout, I talk about several common scales that you might see in your landscape when the crawlers are active. And when we know that, we can use an organic control instead of a systemic or something a little more harmful to the environment. So one of the options, keeping your plants healthy, reduces the risk of scale as well. And I thought I'd mention mosquitoes. If you know Doug Talmay, and a lot of you probably do if you're here attending this, he's an entomologist out of the University of Delaware and has written quite a few books on how we can help invite and support pollinators and change our practices. So when I was speaking to the Elm Grove Beautification Committee, they reminded me of his mosquito trap. So basically, you take a 5-gallon bucket, partially fill it with water, take a handful of straw or hay, put it in there. The straw and hay will ferment. That attracts the female mosquitoes where she'll lay her eggs. Mosquitoes lay their eggs in water. So he talks about then putting a mosquito dunk in that water when the females are laying their eggs. Now, honestly, I'm not sure I will be paying attention. So I threw one in right away. These give me 30 days control. So mosquito dunks are Bacillus Thuringiensis israeliensis. They can kill the larvae of mosquitoes, black fly, and fungus gnats. And one dunk will give you 30 days control. So you might want to let it ferment and then throw it in. I'm kind of forgetful and get busy, so I just did it all at once. I set mine away from where we eat outside and where we tend to gather because I want the mosquitoes going away. And I forget what the area is, but if you do an internet search, you'll see Doug Tallamy, Tallamy, I think is his name. There's his name is in the handout, and just some directions on this and other helpful information in his books. They're very useful. I wanted to end on a beautiful picture because I always hate talking insects and disease and then we end the talk. So, you know, it's really not as bad as sometimes it seems when we're out there fighting the pests. Again, just a reminder, join me for Pollinator Month, the Milwaukee Public Library, the public libraries throughout Wisconsin and the UP have plenty of activities. There's a link to the ATC Grow Smart page where you can find lots of fun family activities and videos. Thanks again to Grow Smart and ATC for sponsoring this webinar and the other activities during Pollinator Month that I've been lucky enough to work on. And thanks again to the Public Libraries Milwaukee for hosting this one. They've been great to work with as always, and public libraries throughout Wisconsin and the UP because they've provided wonderful learning opportunities for all of us so that we can find more ways to help support and attract pollinators. And last but not least, help me grow a gardener or two. Someone inspired you, inspire someone else. Maybe it's a youngster in your life. This is my grandson years ago when he was much younger. He still is my digger. But getting kids out in the garden, they're less, suffer less symptoms. They demonstrate less symptoms of ADHD. Girls raised in a landscape environment suffer less peer pressure. They're more focused. They score better in school. We all know how good we feel. We're more creative. It reduces our stress, lowers our blood pressure. Spread that to the youngsters. Maybe it's a young family down the street. And if you're new to gardening, welcome. We're so glad to have so many more gardeners join this community. It's a great group of people and a great way to be stewards of our environment. Stay in touch. I'm trying to catch up on my emails, so be patient and don't hesitate to email again if I may have overlooked you in my email. And then join me for social media. Links are on the handout. And I'm going to turn it back to Kelly and Beth so we can answer your questions as well.
Thanks, Melinda. And thanks so much for this entire month of wonderful programming. I know you mentioned we do have the recordings of previous workshops from this month. So when we send the follow-up email with the recording for this one, we will also share the link to our YouTube channel where the other two workshops from Pollinator Month are housed as well. So let's get into some questions here.
Great.
Let's see. Maria says, I'm having a hard time accepting the idea of brush piles. I don't want to attract small mammals like rats, mice, rabbits, etc. What can I do instead to help attract bumblebees and other cavity nesting pollinators?
You know, you bring up a good point. You know, I had to garden differently when I lived in the city of Milwaukee. I was on 16th Street, just south of Lincoln. So I was in a very urban area. And so there were certain things I couldn't do in my yard that I can do now that I'm in the country. So a couple things, just having plants that provide nectar. So when I was living on 16th, just south of Lincoln, I was kind of the hardcore gardener in the neighborhood. And so I started, you know, when I bought my house, there was a row of yews and there was grass. And so I started killing the grass and growing perennials. And just by having flowers in your landscape is a great way to bring in and support the pollinators. Bulbs are excellent. They bloom early. So even if you cut your grass, having some spring flowering bulbs, I find bees on crocus and hyacinths and daffodils. And so having some of those, so look for even cultivated plants as well as natives that give you bloom from early spring to fall. So having a nice mix, and that means you have a beautiful beautiful garden. Leaving your plants stand for winter. One of the things I forgot to mention, if they're healthy, you won't have disease issues. Get rid of the sick stuff. But it also increases the hardiness of those plants. And I'll tell you, my neighbors, when we started doing that, thought we were crazy. But even though I was the only hardcore gardener, I started getting lots of butterflies, even hummingbirds in my yard with no feeders. The birds were visiting because they were eating the seeds. So just having plants, brush piles, I'm glad you brought this up. You have to pick the strategies that work in the place you live and with your gardening style. So even just growing plants, leaving a little stubble, you'll be amazed. The new growth will cover it. And, even if you cut your grass in May, just have plants in other parts of your yard that bloom early to support them. So I'm glad you asked that question, because not every strategy is going to fit in every yard. So thanks, Marie, for asking.
So we've got 2 questions about ants.
I've been struggling with them too. I feel your pain.
So let's see. Chris is asking, what would be a good way to get rid of a large ant hill in a raised vegetable bed? The large black ants are residing right in the roots of many of my plants. Thanks for your ideas. And then Patty is asking too, what kills carpenter ants? So I wonder if those are the same.
Okay,
two ant problems.
Good question. So I have sandy soils, I mentioned, and boy, when I'm weeding, I'll find little ants, big ants. What a terrible thing. So a couple things. If you drown them out, they usually move. So that might be an option if you don't want to use a chemical on your plants. Borax, they found, the Milwaukee Public Library used to have a publication, and I don't think they offered anymore, that borax would work on killing ants, but boron can be toxic to plants in a very small amount. There are some ant killers that do use borax as an active ingredient. If you are going to use something, permethrin is a synthetic version of pyrethrin. So it is a synthetic insecticide. And then because they're damaging your plants, you might want to do something, okay? But if you do, you want to take a dandelion digger and pull it back and pour that permethrin, a granular form, down to get the queen ant so that the nest moves, or you kill the majority of the insects and they move out of the way. I usually say tolerate the ants if they're not causing damage. It sounds like they are. Carpenter ants only nest in rotting wood. So the real key to success is get rid of the rotting wood. So if you've got a tree that has a rotten center, it might be a hazard, and you might want to get a certified arborist. If you go to Trees Are Good, you can find a certified arborist that works in your area. And these are arborists who have demonstrated educational background, experience, and a level of knowledge through testing. So it kind of sets them apart from just somebody with a chainsaw and a pickup. So if you're looking for an arborist, if you've got carpenter ants in your tree, it means you've got rot, and that's a problem. If you're finding carpenter ants inside, sometimes when it's hot and dry, they just wander inside looking for water, but they're often nesting behind, maybe in the wall behind your shower, where there might be some leakage and some rot, maybe behind your dishwasher if there's a leaky pipe, or under a sink. You'll sometimes find them under your eaves if the water isn't managed correctly. So if you're finding those, you want to make sure you take care of the rotten wood. There are some traps that the insects take back to their nests so that you can use those strategically, minimizing the damage out in the environment. A friend asked me how to manage ants. They were by her gate, and I just said, live with them. But I understand when they're damaging your plant roots because it's desiccating, and when you expose them, you might choose to do something. Drowning may discourage them and move them along. Otherwise, you may decide to treat with something. And permethrin's relatively low toxicity, and you're putting it in the soil right where the ants are nesting. So you're minimizing the exposure to other insects.
All right, we've got a question from Alan. Alan says, with the baking soda method of pest control, after everything is mixed, is it applied using a spray bottle or some other method?
Yeah, good question. Some people will use a sprinkler to pour it on, like a watering can with large holes, that rose, to sprinkle it on that way, because you got to get good. It's probably the easiest way to apply it. That's a great question. If you've got a spray nozzle that has big enough openings, or a sprayer that you can do that, that's another option. That's easier to get good coverage that way. But that's a great question, because it is challenging to get that through the sprayer. So a lot of people just end up mixing it and then using a watering can to apply it.
Quite a few questions on pest control here.
Okay.
Let's see, Amanda would like to know, what are your thoughts on beneficial nematodes for grub control? Also, if time allows, any thoughts on neem oil for orchard diseases and pests?
Okay, good question. So beneficial nematodes, there's some really good research on beneficial nematodes for boring insects. Iris Spore, a friend of mine, actually we worked together at the City of Milwaukee Forestry, had good success using it. Nematodes, and yes, the grubs for Japanese beetles. There's some new research. I'm glad you brought that up, because I should have mentioned it. There are nematodes that will go after soil grubs, and specifically Japanese beetles. I was working with the guys from Garden America, and they've had some good success managing certain beetles. So make sure the nematode is specific to the insect you're controlling. You need to keep the soil moist to keep them alive, because they're living organisms. They're bad nematodes, but these are the beneficial ones that eat other insects. And so that is an option. Arbico, I think, is one source, ARBICO. I think they sell beneficial insects, including nematodes, but do an internet search, look for some reviews of the companies, find out how they manage it, and giving the specific insect. So neem oil is a plant-derived oil. The story I heard, and I don't know if it's true, is that a greenhouse grower from Sheboygan was in India vacationing, and he's sitting on the pier, and all these insects are bothering him, and all the folks that lived there had no problem. And he's like, what's your secret? And they said neem. And you'll often see neem in health food stores. They use it sometimes for laundry detergents and even toothpaste. Don't do that unless it's designed for that purpose, okay? But neem oil, one formulation manages diseases, one formulation manages insect problems, including mites, which are spider relatives, not true insects. And so it is beneficial. It is acts as a repellent to some extent, but it also is a contact insecticide. Some people have talked about it working for Japanese beetles. If you apply it 20 days before the Japanese beetles are expected to arrive, so we're a little late for Wisconsin. Once they're here, most people have told me they haven't had really good success when the populations get big. It is a broad spectrum insecticide, so that means it kills a wide range of insects. So you want to be careful when you're applying it that you're not coating the good guys as well as the bad guys. So neem is another organic option. As always, read and follow label directions carefully. Good question.
Another question from Ellen. When lawn care services talk about treating the lawn for grubs, is it primarily for Japanese beetles, Japanese beetle grubs, or other ones?
Probably mostly Japanese beetles. Bill bugs, their immature stage is also a grub. June beetles or May beetles, depending on, I think, where you grew up and what your parents called them. They're those big fat beetles, man. There were a lot of them this year. Their life cycle's every 3 years. So we don't typically see a lot of damage from them. They will occasionally munch on plants, the adults. The grubs are underground for several years. So we usually don't see a lot of damage, but boy, they are annoying, aren't they, when they're at your light and on your windows. Bill bugs can cause damage. Typically, I would ask that question, what grubs are you treating for? And, lawn care companies tend to, to be able to make it an affordable option so they can reach a lot of clients. They kind of have a standard treatment. We'll fertilize this many times. We do a pre-emergent, we do a post-emergent, we do this, da, 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 da. So if you're working with a lawn care company, you have the right to say, no, this is how I need you to manage my lawn. There are a couple that are doing organic control. They're hard to find because it's kind of pricey, and getting enough clients to pay to keep them in business has been a struggle for those companies. But I would ask them, what are you treating for? What is the active ingredient? And then when are you going to come and treat? So my guess is they're probably treating for Japanese beetle grubs because those are the most common ones. Luckily in Wisconsin, we tend to have few lawn insects, but grubs, the Japanese beetle grubs are one of the ones that's doing some damage.
So Terry shares, in regard to the ant question, regular, not quick cooking grits will kill ants. They eat them and can't digest it. One ant feeds the queen and bam, no more ants, and doesn't hurt your soil or veggies.
And what was that again?
Not quick cooking grits.
Not quick cooking grits. Okay.
Yeah.
I am not a fan of grits, but now I will be. So, and whoever, I hope you're still listening, whoever has that, I would still put it down the hole so it gets to the queen sooner, or at least it's on that whole track. So thank you for that, Terry. I appreciate it.
Let's see, got a question from Kelly. What would you recommend instead of mulch around the base of a tree?
You know, ground cover. Mulch, if you're dealing with jumping worms, this is such a dilemma for so many of us. I did the blog on no dig gardening, and one of the things is they're bringing in compost, and I'm like, those of us worried about jumping worms are trying to figure out where to get the compost. And so recycling leaves up from your property, or making your own wood chips, renting a chipper, but ground covers are an excellent option, and it's actually great for the trees and shrubs. So if you create planting beds around your trees, or connect your trees and shrubs together for a larger bed, and you put perennial ground covers, that's a great option. Canadian ginger works very well in those areas with heavy shade. One of my favorite ones is barrenwort or epimedium. It's not native, but it flowers early when the leaves emerge. They're heart-shaped leaves on wiry stems, turns red in the fall. Just a gorgeous plant. And it tolerates dry shade, which is often a problem when we're growing under trees. Some of the smaller daylilies, hostas, of course, if it's shady. Siberian bug loss. One of the things I like to recommend, though, is if you've got an existing tree, don't till up the soil. You may want to cut the grass really short, and maybe the first year, or you may, a sod cutter is an option, or removing the sod physically, or cutting the grass short and covering it with newspaper or cardboard. If you can wait a season and you don't want to put wood chips on there, you'll be looking at the cardboard, but it will kind of smother the grass and break it down. Otherwise, you could do that, cut holes in it, and plant your perennial ground covers in between. If you've been mulching under your trees, you probably have some decent soil under there. What we don't want to do is rototill, because we'll damage a lot of those feeder roots, which are in the top 12 inches of the soil. So if you can carefully physically remove the sod and then plant those ground covers, if you can then mulch with shredded leaves from your yard, that will help keep the roots cool and moist, help suppress the weeds until the ground covers fill in. So that's a way to, in the long run, take care of the problem. You'll still have some weeds, but you won't be mulching every year, because those ground covers eventually will fill in and cover the soil and create a good environment. They're less competitive than grass to trees and shrubs.
A question from Ginger. Can you repeat what you recommended for dried brown leaves at the bottom of phlox?
Oh, okay. So probably for powdery mildew. So with powdery mildew, it looks like someone sprinkled baby powder on the leaves. And then what happens is that blocks, the fungus actually blocks the sunlight, and then the leaves can turn yellow and brown. You often see more of it at the base of the plant, again, where there's less sunlight reaching it. And so that can be an issue. There are some leaf spots that will attack also, but you're right. The leaves tend to brown from the bottom because they're more shaded. So a couple things to do. Looking for resistant varieties. If you're adding new phlox to your garden, thinning out the stems in spring. So as those stems emerge, take about 1/4 of them out. That's going to let more light and more airflow through so that you get, you reduce the risk of powdery mildew. You can also use the baking soda formula, and it's in your handout. It's a combination of baking soda, insecticidal soap, or horticulture oil. They just act as a spreader sticker in a gallon of water, or the lightweight horticulture oils will give you control with just the lightweight horticulture oils. And I was reading, I think it was Colorado State University, where it provided up to 30 days. The baking soda you need to apply about once a week. Way too much work for me. And then the other option is to live with it, but then plant something shorter in front of it to mask the dry, dead leaves, and then still see the flowers. So this is in your handout as well. And I'm happy to repeat. So please feel free to ask. I'm always happy to repeat, but I don't want you to end the webinar and go, oh, I didn't ask, or I forgot, or should have written it down.
Yeah, and please check the chat. I know Beth has been adding a link to the handout in there.
Thank you.
We'll also follow up when we send the recording with another attachment of the handout as well. So you'll get it both of those ways if you haven't gotten it already from us with the reminder email. Let's see here. Nancy would like to know, when you have Japanese beetles, what is the best fix to get rid of them?
Okay, well, and it all depends on what your gardening goal is. So I have to tell you, so I started these cannas from seed, and I was so excited. I had a huge bed of them in front of my house, and the Japanese beetles moved in. So I started with the can of soapy water, knocking them in. Trust me, I got bored with that pretty quick. I don't know how Old Brick does it. I guess they have great volunteers and more tolerant staff than me. And they finally won. Ben Fuda, who does a show for PBS, had recommended using a small hand vac. And I thought, that's a great option, because when you're trying to knock them into the can of soapy water, do it early in the day. They tend to be congregate and they're sluggish. It's easier to get them into that can of soapy water. But a hand vac, suck them up, but be sure you empty the bag so you don't bring it inside and release them in the house into a can of soapy water. I'm going to try the Beetle Gone this year, and Beetle Juice. I'm keeping an eye out for them. And that's an organic. And I really am trying. I have frogs, and I'm lucky enough to have salamanders and toads, as well as lots of beneficial insects. So I'm also careful about using insecticides, because toads and frogs and salamanders have very thin skin, and so they can really be harmed easily by pesticides. So I'm really trying to be very careful how I manage any pest for the beneficial insects, as well as those that are managing the bad guys for me. So I'm anxious to try, and I've heard good reports from entomologists and gardeners who have used the Beetle Juice, JUS, and Beetle Gone, but I haven't seen it provided in garden centers yet. But I think Gurney, Arbico, and if you do an internet search, you'll find some sources for it as well. But I had to do a mail order for it. So you might have to order it. Probably now would be a good time, so you have it in time for the beetles when they start invading the garden. One of the other things I forgot to mention, sorry, Kelly, is covering plants like beans that don't need to be pollinated, but that the Japanese beetles love, or basil. If you cover it with the row cover, before they arrive, they can't lay their egg. They can't reach your plants to eat it. So that's another option too. So covering your plants. But if you need pollinators to pollinate the flowers, then obviously you can't cover them and keep the pollinators out when you're trying to keep the Japanese beetles out. Forgot to mention that earlier.
See, Anita would like to know whether lady beetles are good or bad. I hope they're good, because they're my favorite beetle.
Lady beetles are great. You may hear some bad press about them because of the multicolored Asian lady beetles. Those were brought in to the United States to control aphids on pecans and soybeans, I think. and they have spread throughout the country. So the downside, they do eat bad insects, okay? So they are helping us. The problem is they are breeding with our native lady beetle. They're out competing our native lady beetle, so they're kind of crowding them out. So that's the downside. If you look on their back, you'll see a little, almost like an M at the top, right between the head and their crunchy wings. Those are the Asian lady beetles, and they often go into, in the winter, they'll look for a place to nest, and they often end up in our homes and attics, and I'll find them in my light fixtures as it warms. They'll kind of come down. I find them, I either throw them outside, they'll die in the cold if it's winter, or throw them on my house plants if I've got some aphids for them to eat. So they do smell when they're smashed. So that's another downside. So I don't think we're going to get rid of them. And how would you get rid of them and not hurt the good guys? So I think they're kind of here to stay. And that's one of the things we always want to be concerned when we're bringing insects in to manage other insects. So not that you did. So it's okay to like lady beetles. They do a lot of good things for us in the garden.
Terry would like to know, do you have any recommendations for preventing blight on tomato plants?
Good question. It's tomato season now. Well, not quite ripe yet in Wisconsin, but a couple things. There are resistant varieties. Cornell University does a great job of testing a lot of vegetables. They're out of New York, so their climate is similar enough to Wisconsin. A lot of extension services. I always look for university-based, research-based information, and there are some early blight-resistant tomatoes, so resistant varieties. Proper spacing. Stake or tower your tomatoes, so get them up off the ground and make sure there's plenty of room for airflow, light penetration. I was a small space gardener, and I still have to remember I have room, and I'm always overcrowding my tomatoes to get one more in. So giving them room to grow. Healthy soil, adding compost to the soil, whether you do it on the surface and let the insects take it down or you incorporate it. Cornell University found not only did it improve drainage and moisture holding ability of fast draining soils, but it also increased the health of the soil and the plants, and they tend to suffer less insect and disease problems. So healthy soil, once again. If the problem develops at the first sign, you can use an organic fungicide. Those are usually copper or sulfur containing fungicides. So check the label that it will control blight on tomatoes. It's another one that you'll need to repeat every 10 to 14 days, depending on the weather. Rotating your plants if you have room. I was in the city and I could rotate my tomatoes from one end of the garden to the other. And I also grew peppers and eggplants in there. So they were all susceptible to many of the same diseases. But I had great soil, good sunlight, and great airflow. So that allowed me to escape a lot of the blight issues. So healthy soil, resistant varieties, proper care, staking. If you can water at the soil surface, mulching the soil, that prevents a lot of soil-borne diseases from splashing up. And then if you decide to treat, looking for, if you prefer an organic product, but always read and follow label directions, whether it's organic or synthetic. Late blight is the one that kills it, seems to kill your tomatoes and potatoes overnight. And if you think you have late blight, let the extension service know, because potatoes are such a big crop here in Wisconsin, especially, that we want to make sure it doesn't spread and really damage the large crops. That's what caused the potato famine in Ireland, was late blight. So again, all those cultural things, and then if you need to interseed, UW Extension has a good brochure. If you just do an internet search, UWEX, that'll get you to the extension service. Organic control of late blight on tomatoes. And they did a nice publication on how to manage it, rotating some of the organic pesticides and fungicides and things. So check that out.
Let's see, I've got a question from Karen. Did you say that jumping worms are in purchased bagged mulch? Is that something that we should be aware of?
I had a master gardener at one of my talks who told me they bought a bag of mulch and they found jumping worms in it. So that that was what I was told by someone who knew what jumping worms were, and I felt was a fairly reliable source. What you may want to do is, some of those come in plastic bags, and UW found that, University of Wisconsin found that if mulch and compost is heated to 104 degrees from top to bottom, that can kill the cocoons and eggs and the adults. So that might be something you want to isolate. A lot of those plastic bags, right now it might not be hard. We've had a lot of hot weather to see if you could get the temperatures to 104, maybe isolate the mulch. It's a scary thing. I'm faced with the same thing. I was talking to somebody at a talk I did at Ebert's on Saturday, and we were just saying, as much as you can keep the materials on your property and create your own compost, which I know isn't possible for everybody. Use your fall leaves off your property. If you know what you have, that's one way to manage it. I have some construction happening on my property right now, and I'm trying to find some options for amending the soil and being sure I don't get jumping worms. And I'll tell you honestly, the scary thing is when I make phone calls to places, a lot of them don't even know what jumping worms are. So I think that's on my list of things to accomplish this winter, spread the word to the profession. There's a mulch called Billy Goat mulch. Juan Schneider Landscaping, he sells it to landscape companies, but one of his products is pasteurized 3 times, and the temperatures get way over 104 degrees. And we use that mulch at the Wisconsin We Energy Gardens, and I was very impressed with it. It breaks down quickly, and I'm okay with that because it's improving the soil, but it's providing that suppression of weeds and conservation of moisture for the growing season. So if you have a landscaper you're working with, you may want to have him see if he can find and access the Billy Goat mulch that's been 3 times pasteurized. I'm hoping more and more providers will be letting us know. I was looking at mushroom compost. Now, if it's right from the farm, it's great. However, how's it being stored? Do they have jumping worms in the area where it's being stored before it's being delivered to you? So those are all questions to ask. And I don't have a really good answer for you because I'm struggling with this as well because of the jumping worm issue.
Got a comment from Nancy in the chat saying, see, when you deal with some businesses that don't know what jumping worms are, walk away.
Exactly. And that's exactly a question you need to ask. How are you managing jumping worms? And if they go, huh? Exactly. So thank you. You're right.
Just a clarification from Danielle. When we talk about 104 degrees, is that Fahrenheit?
Oh, thank you. It's Fahrenheit. Thank you. I'm trying to do better. So if you're one of my Canadian friends, I'm really working, I grew up when we were supposed to make the conversion to meters and centigrade, and then the US gave up on that. And so I'm trying to be better. So that's Fahrenheit. Thank you for reminding me.
Question from Karen about tomato plants. Rabbits chewed the stem on tomato plants about halfway through. It's leaning to the side now. Is there something that can be wrapped around the stem to support it?
Yeah, so a couple things. I've actually, when I've trenched tomatoes, heard the stem crack, buried it, and they did reroot. You could try putting a stake. And then just there's some tapes and Velcro tapes that you might want to just kind of lightly tape it to the stake to support it. Once it hopefully, there's enough there to support it, you may end up needing to cut it as the stem gets a little bit bigger in diameter, but a stake may help. I'm guessing it's up too high to just bury that part of the stem because you can bury tomato plants and they'll form roots all along the edge. I don't know if that would help, or could you put, I'm just being creative here. This is how and then you have to tell us what worked for you, okay? Could you put something, a cylinder or something around and put soil to get to that area? So support it, but then allowing the stem to root above as well as below along the stem, and maybe that would help. But some of the tape you see used, there's some, that kind of stretchy green tape. Try to do that. Maybe that might help hold it intact. I'll tell you, plants, I've seen amazing things. Plants are more resilient than we give them credit, and you have nothing to lose, right? So fingers crossed, and try to keep it intact. And if it's not too high up, maybe even burying it and staking it as well.
Mary Jo would like to know, can I take a class to become a master gardener?
Oh, so what you want to do, depending on where you live, but contact your local University of Wisconsin Extension Service. If there's master gardeners all over the United States, Canada. They have an international meeting. So if you're not in the US, there might be a master gardener program. I started the program that's in existence now in Milwaukee many, many years ago. They're celebrating, I think they said their 30th anniversary. And so a couple fun things, you get to learn a lot, usually from the university specialists and extension agents. In return for that, you volunteer and give time back to the community, whether it's educating kids, helping with community gardens, doing outreach, giving talks, and a variety of things. So it's a great way to be part of a community of gardeners and to give back and share your love and your passion and keep learning as well. So it's run by the Extension Service. Chicago Botanic Garden also has master gardeners that work there. So some botanic garden and arboreta also house the master gardener program in conjunction, usually with the university in their state or region. So check with your university or county extension service. And if you don't know how to find them, there is a place, if you do an internet search, that lists all of the extension services across the United States anyway.
Thank you. So it looks like that covers all of our questions. Again, keep a lookout for a follow-up email coming from the library within a couple of days with a recording to this program, as well as the handout attachment that was used throughout the presentation this evening. And we'll also, of course, include links to our previous Pollinator Month workshops that we've done this month with Melinda. Otherwise, I want to thank you so much, Melinda, for all of your expertise and creativity and sharing your knowledge this month. It's been really exciting to host something special with you. Yeah, I like all of our workshops with you are special, but being able to celebrate Pollinator Month this year has been really exciting, and I hope we can do this again with you.
Me too. So all of you too, please share what you're doing, your projects, and inspire others. So on social media, #GrowSmart22. We want to let everyone know what you're doing to make a difference. And you never know, you'll inspire someone else. All the great ideas, I learn something every time I give a webinar or teach in person. So I'm lucky, I love my job. So please share what you know with others or projects you do. You'll be surprised how many people you'll inspire.
So again, keep an eye out for that follow-up email. I just also want to tell everyone here quickly, if you're interested in more programming like this, we do host a monthly climate action book club. Our next meeting is coming up this coming Monday. We're talking about the Children's Bible by Lydia Millet. And next month, we're going to be hosting Clean Wisconsin at Milwaukee Public Library downtown for their Doug LaFollette Environmental Speakers Series program. So that'll be very exciting. I'll include a link to that in the follow-up email. Excellent. As well. So, all right. Well, everyone have a wonderful month, a rest of Pollinator Month, I should say, and have a wonderful summer. And we will follow up with more resources. And thanks so much for tuning in this evening. We're just so happy for your support and excitement to learn more about Pollinator Month. And we'll be back with more exciting workshops, I'm sure, in the future.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
All right, thanks. Bye now. Take care.